I think it's really important to think about the ethics of how we stage trauma, the ethics of how we look after people who are making that work, especially since the pandemic.
Hi, Bryony, how are you?
Hello, I'm well, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the channel today. In a moment, we're going to dig down on the topic of, I guess we can call it trauma-based theatre. But we're going to get to that in a little while. First of all, tell us all about you.
So I am currently a researcher at Northumbria University, and I'm in the final year of my PhD, which means I have to finish it soon, which is terrifying. I write on systemic trauma in British theatre, sort of thinking about how it's staged and also how it manifests in rehearsal rooms and in practice as well. Before I did this, I was a producer, so I worked in London for about 2.5 years doing production assisting and then general managing, helping producer take UK shows over to the US. So I suppose by trade, I am a producer, and that's kind of my stake in the theatre world, but I haven't done any of that since the pandemic, as I've been focusing on my PhD, which is like weirdly good timing to have something else to do during that period. But yes, so I suppose that takes us to now. I'm in university currently and have to submit by May.
All right.
Help me.
So originally when we spoke, you were going to come on and talk about the theatre landscape in Newcastle. And then you said to me, actually, I'd really like to talk about my research project I'm doing at the moment. So tell us why. Tell us why would you like to discuss this? What are you doing? What are you investigating? And before we actually get into the questions and the guts of the interview, but tell us about your project.
Well, it's because I love talking about me, clearly. I would love at some point to talk about the Newcastle theatre scene, because it's wonderful.
Yeah, definitely.
I think part of it is that I'm at the stage of my PhD now where sharing my work and talking to other people is becoming very vital. There's an element of my work which will be talking to theatre practitioners about what they imagine to be better, more ethical ways of working. I think I have the tendency to hide sometimes when thinking about this, because we were speaking about this just before we started recording, but the part of this which is my subjectivity and what I think about staging trauma, as opposed to kind of the wider cultural conversations we're having about it. I think it's really important to speak about it, firstly because post Me Too, which is kind of my wheelhouse in my research, there have been so many shows, particularly staging sexual violence, male violence against women, and even within the theatre industry itself, perhaps with A Bitter Wheat by David Mamet, and Stephen Berkoff wrote a show about Harvey Weinstein. So that very specific niche is quite relevant to my research, but it'll be interesting to talk to you about it as well, because you're another pair of eyes that sees a lot of theatre. And yeah, I think it's really important to think about the ethics of how we stage trauma, the ethics of how we look after people who are making that work, especially since the pandemic, when I think a lot of the endemic issues that there are in British theatre in particular are compounded because we've kind of come out of it and now everything's going again. And I think sometimes the well-being of practitioners can be sidelined. Something I don't talk about in my work, but is really important for that, is things like intimacy coordination, which is becoming more and more popular in helping to stage narratives of trauma. But yeah, I think I've got just loads to say on this, and it'll just be really nice to chat to you about it.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? It's nice to give your points of view some air. I found that even more in the past 12 months of having the book out, like just and being quite scared of saying some of the stuff that I've said. But yeah, what's really lovely is you end up just interrogating your own point of view as well, but also people start to open up maybe and talk to you. And yeah, it's lovely just to get the conversation going, isn't it? And this is why when you suggested this to be the topic, I was like, oh yes, because I can spot what you're talking about, but I don't know how to talk about it. But I know something's there, something's happening. And I even called it trauma theatre, but I didn't know it was called trauma theatre. I've just named it that, but it's not necessarily that. But I can see why you wanted to talk about it. So with this in mind, then, do you think, or have you felt, there's been a change in the theatre making world, in the original theatre making context? Do you think there seems to be a focus on producing theatre that is rooted in trauma? Have you seen this happen?
I think in some ways there's been, theatre has always staged violence and social issues that, I suppose, how you define trauma. In fact, this might be quite important to sort of stipulate, in that trauma is, there are so many different conceptions of what trauma is. The definition that I use is systemic trauma. So this allows me to not just think about physical acts of violence, but also the everyday microaggressions that queer people might experience, or racism, transphobia. These are all underpinned by feminist psychologist theories such as Muriel P. Root and Laura Brown, and Judith Herman, who's quite a big figure in this kind of realm, who kind of, they acknowledge that trauma and trauma-related symptoms can emerge from a series of smaller events, or from expecting bad things to happen, which as queer people, maybe we can attest to that, the idea of, you fearing something even though it might not happen. That feels important to say, because it might make sense of sort of how I talk about trauma and trauma theatre in this interview. But in your face theatre with Sarah Kane and Mark Ravenhill in the 90s, that was very much violent depictions of rape, and in Blasted, there's the death of a baby. Like, there's really visceral encounters with violence, and I think that does sometimes still happen, and I've seen it on stage in recent years. But I think specifically since things like BLM and with Me Too, or the 2017 iteration of Me Too, that there just seems to be so much more sort of cultural examinations of the suffering that people who experience marginalization have, and that is also kind of what I would class as staging trauma or systemic trauma. And that it's almost every theatre production that I have seen, and maybe it's just what I'm choosing, but there's thousands yearly that kind of engage with this sort of thing. So it does seem to be that theatre is still at the forefront of wanting to reflect on some of the darker sides of our society. And yeah.
Well, why do you think that is? Do you think that's because of the medium of theatre? It's because it's kind of like the listening space, the watching space, the sharing space, community, etc. Is it that, do you think? Or is it down to the performers now? Or where's it coming from, do you think? What's that drive?
It's a really good question. I suppose because I'm a producer and not a theatre maker, I can only reflect on that, or kind of think about why I would go to see it. I think there's something about, especially if you're queer or have experienced sexual violence, which I have in my life, and many women have, there's something about seeing stories that are not your own but relate to your own on stage that is very affirming and validating. And I write about that a lot in my research, about this idea that seeing something that looks like your story on stage is an extremely special and validating thing. And I really like that about seeing certain kinds of trauma on stage. I like that when it's told from a perspective that is nurturing. I'm not saying that's the only kind of trauma that should exist, but I think this is where there's an element of subjectivity to this. I suppose we can ask you the same question. I'm not sure about this, and I'm not sure why there is a drive to. Maybe it's because it is in the nature of theatre and has been forever to want to contribute to culture by staging the things that are on people's minds. And I don't know, but I think we see it a lot in students. I don't teach theatre making here in Northumbria, but I have been around a lot of the students and watched their shows, and almost all of their productions, when they are devising short pieces for examinations, are about some sort of trauma. And I find that so interesting, because it's like, I'm not saying that they think that trauma theatre is synonymous with good theatre, but it's interesting because, even from this, emerging into the industry, it's on people's minds of thinking that that's what theatre does and should do, or that they want to do that. So I think it is still kind of, their entry point into theatre is going to be having devised some really dark stuff, in some of their work. I think it's really interesting. What do you think? Why would you do you encounter that work? I want to know.
I mean, I do, because I'm doing a lot of university work at the moment, and I definitely when I ask them what type of theatre they want to make, there is most certainly a trend. Most certainly the trend that you spotted. I see it too, and I've been around about 10 universities in the past 3 months, and without fail, they are talking about their personal journeys for sure. I think, just zooming back a bit, then I just wonder if it's, as a theatre maker, I guess it's maybe it's really evident, maybe because the theatre in theory, its desire is always to represent the world that it lives in, right? And so, and whoever's in charge of those spaces, but whoever's leading that project in that space, then that's the space that it gets represented in, isn't it? It's there. So maybe it is literally theatre just doing its job, that it's representing the culture. It's fascinating for me, but who knows? But I've definitely felt the wave in the past, say, 6, 7, 8 years, and it's fascinating to see where it will go. So I have a difficult question for you then. Do you think that the theatre is the right space to explore trauma?
I suppose yes and no. I think it depends. And again, subjectivity. I mentioned before with the play Bitter Wheat, which was staged, I think it was it 2016, but it had John Malkovich as basically a character that's based on Harvey Weinstein. And I didn't see it, and I didn't want to see it, because I could see on the casting list that I think there were only maybe 2 women in it, and only a couple of the creative team were women. And there was a review that came out, published on the platform Exion, that kind of confirmed everything that I thought about it, which is that it's very much about the character, John Malkovich's character. That I find troubling, because do we need that perspective? I mean, of course, yes, it's interesting, but I don't want to see that, because that feels harmful to me, to have to time and time again be thinking about the perpetrators. I don't want there to solve my problems, but I want to see myself reflected in it in some way. But that's subjective. And there's a lot of work emerging in performance studies, so trauma and performance studies, which is where I sit in academia. Such as my supervisor, Patrick Duggan, wrote a book in 2012 called Trauma Tragedy. And he wrote about this incredible quality that theatre has. He calls it mimetic shimmering, which is the idea that an audience member is, when they're encountering trauma, that they're held in this state where it's the real and the representational, and the fluctuation between those two, of witnessing trauma and then feeling the trauma of witnessing trauma, is actually kind of mimicking the way that trauma can manifest. And I really agree with that, and that's why trigger warnings and things like that are really important, because you might not want to be in that. You might not want to be put in that feeling of discomfort when you're seeing a show, and that has to be considered by theatres when they're staging them, which is why I'm a huge advocate for trigger warnings. Some people think they're silly, and I just don't think they're not. I think it's great to give people the option to witness things that they might not be okay to see on the day-to-day. Yeah, there's also Miriam Horton's work, which talks about theatre as being able to shine a light on the marginalised, which is, I think you see it a lot in British theatre, definitely, of this, you know, trying to find stories that haven't yet been staged and then putting them to the forefront. So I really like that work. And so I think it depends for me on the perspective that it's being told and the way that it's being told. There are stories and perspectives that we have had, you know, shoved in our faces for years and years. And I don't want to see those, but that's my personal preference, perhaps. In my research, I talk about the real importance of considering perspective, especially when staging things like sexual violence, because there's shows that I write about that are misinformed and have not done their due diligence in thinking about the research on it, particularly in shows about things like false accusations of rape when women, it hardly ever happens, but I've seen shows where they're perpetuating this idea, and that's wrong. That's not correct. That's bad research. So I think, like any production that stages anything, I think it's all about the research and development. It's the thinking about why you're staging the story and how you're staging it. Are you looking after the people as they're making that show? I think it just takes a lot of consideration, and considering the amount of shows that we have that are about trauma, not all of those are going to have done that.
Yeah. It's almost like, where do you frame the story, isn't it? Which I guess is always the question whenever you make an original piece of theatre. Do you start it here, etc.? I'm trying to think of theatre shows maybe I've watched which were about a trauma and when they've impacted me, and it's mostly been not showing what the actual trauma was. It's mostly been about words, actually, about dialogue between well-formed characters. Do you think that then, so let's say, because we both said that we see that younger theatre makers are running towards making trauma-based theatre, do you see, or have you felt, or do you think that there should be a structure now that needs to be, you know, built, inflated to provide younger theatre makers on how to make trauma-based theatre? Do you see it happening? Because it could be a little bit of an eggy area, couldn't it? Because you know, if students are making, you know, original work that's based in something personal, I'm wondering if the infrastructures need to, you know, morph and change and modernize, and there needs to be something in place. Do you see any of that, or do you think there should be? Or
so I don't teach acting or theatre making, but I wonder if with the rise of things like intimacy coordinators, that should start affecting how theatre is made in universities. And I'm not sure if it does, but you would think that having intimacy coordinators for the kind of staging of difficult subject matters and the physical side of things, you would think that would also be afforded to students as a fundamental part of ethically creating that work. There are also, do you know Clark Bain? He's I think he runs, I think it's called Geese Theatre, or
another name.
He published his PhD recently, which is about, he made this tool called the drama spiral, and it's really amazing because it's applicable to any room of making theatre, and it's basically this spiral where there's different levels of staging, what he calls the staging of personal stories, but obviously that is really synonymous with traumatic stories. And it's got a kind of framework of what levels of care you need depending on how resolved the trauma is, or if you're going into a room and doing something like applied theatre, or if you've got a room full of students and you have no idea what their backgrounds are, they might have, you know, they might have been traumatized in any number of ways. There has to be a way of making sure that they are being cared for, and the spiral is basically don't make work if you're not qualified to, you know, or don't help to facilitate that work if you're not. And I don't know, maybe it'd be interesting to post a link to that, because if I was a theatre maker, I would find it really useful just as a gauge of thinking, what boundaries am I crossing? And I think that's especially important in drama schools, especially with their history, with things like bullying and things like that. Like it's been talked about a lot, especially post Me Too, about experiences that can happen in conservatoires. And that kind of tool, or that kind of way of approaching things, it's more about, if you've got a director or a lecturer, when you kind of inherently have this, you're perceived as having power. I think that a lot of it lies with them on how they're doing this. You have to know when you're overstepping a boundary, and know how to facilitate that work. But that's all because I don't teach. I can't attest to what is actually happening in rehearsal rooms, and I bet it's different in every single drama school and every university. I mean, maybe you have more enlightenment on that. I would like to know your experience of it, because I'm, if you teach theatre making in universities and conservatoires or in training environments, have you seen a conscious effort to help students to facilitate the staging of difficult narratives?
I haven't actually gone as far as getting a project realised in that setting, but I've had a couple of workshops with students who are exploring their own stories, and what I tend to do is get them to dig down on it personally, and they can share their ideas if they want to. They don't have to share, but I just ask some simple questions first, which is, what do you want to discuss in your piece? Because, and then I underpin it by saying that I think the theatre is a discussion space. It's a, you're having a dialogue with the audience, etc. So what do you want to discuss? And then I just try to get them to boil that down a little bit further, so they're kind of anchored to the real core of, well, why is this going on stage? Tell us about this. Yeah. And then thinking a little bit further, then I might get them to just do some gentle stuff, like maybe give it a working title just for now, something that you're happy with to live with, and then maybe do a 3 or 4 line description. And this is all personal for a while. And if you want to share it, you can share it to the group. And most people do share it. I'd say a lot of people are very brave and they just share it. Because at some point they're going to have to share it, right? That's the point of doing the story, is that they're going to. I suppose
they have to know they feel safe. And I suppose I think that's kind of also, it sounds similar to what the drama spiral does in ways as well, just this trying to facilitate this consciousness about how you feel about talking about something, or opening that, that kind of box, so it's not, I think it's just the consciousness, isn't it? But I don't know, I'm an actor and I don't teach.
I think there's a real strength in nailing the discussion, actually, because it's actually a powerful place, isn't it? To be on stage and perform, you are actually in a place of power. So
it's already vulnerable. It's already inherently a very, very vulnerable thing to do.
And then when you're out there, though, if you're the writer, if you're the maker, you have a space. You have a space to discuss. So what do you want to do? Let's do this. So it's also can be exciting. But so I don't really know the answer to the question necessarily, but I think slow steps and offer to discuss with the group, because I believe in cross-pollination. Setting it out to the group as well. And in some ways, you're kind of preempting my last question, because I was going to say to you as well, I said, what does it look like to you? What would a space look like, a safe space to make trauma-based work?
It's a really good question. It's funnily enough, this is going to be a long-winded answer that doesn't actually give you one. The last part of my thesis is about emergence, and thinking about the emergence of more positive ethical practices. A lot of my thesis is very critical and negative, thinking about residual patriarchal values that are in British theatre and how they have got us to where we are now, with kind of quite endemic power abuses and the sorts of things that were illuminated with the 2017 iteration of Me Too. I think the answer is I don't know, and I want to find out. And I think that work is long work, and there are lots of people thinking about it. And what I want to do in my research is get in the room with organisations, theatre organisations, who are actively trying to address even one element of it, whether that's, you know, for example, the new diorama are in a theatre of no-shows because a season of no-shows because they want to stop and think about their infrastructure and sustainability and that sort of thing. That feels like a really radical intervention. I think these are the sorts of things I want to start thinking about, and absolutely will do in this last phase of my research. But I think it's not looking for one answer. It's not looking for one way that theatre looks. It's calling out bad practice. It's acknowledging that quite often really important work is a mask sometimes. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there are certain practitioners who have been ousted for being inappropriate or abusive in ways, who are some of the most influential figures in British theatre because of the narratives they're staging. So I think there is no one answer. Some of it is a huge cultural shift that needs to happen, so there's less sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, those massive things. But you know, theatre can do a lot for its own world, and I think it's having conversations, it's acknowledging that not everybody is going to have the same view on this. But my approach to it is going to be just looking for flickers of things that look a little bit more positive, because if we can start reflecting on these more positive practices, then, you know, that's how change happens. It's systemic, you know, positive systemic changes to solve some of the negative systemic kind of problems that we've got. So I think it's a massive question. So my thesis can't do it, but, you know, hopefully part of my career going forward will be to help facilitate these conversations ongoing, because we all need to be in dialogue with each other, from training to rehearsal and development to staging. Freelancers are going to experience a different director perhaps in 3 shows in a year. You know, you're always gonna have different directors, producers. Freelancing is hard work, and I think having an element of knowing how to protect yourself is part of it, and to know what your own boundaries are and what kind of work you want to make and how to make it. And sometimes when we've got this goal of the artwork, the theatre product that we're making, if we're all working towards that, I think sometimes that's when our instinct to protect ourselves gets sidelined, because we've got this pressure, this huge pressure to make the work or to pay rent or to do all of that. So I think there's so many elements that, like, small and big, and it's massive. But I think that there are people who want to think about this, and organisations taking responsibility for themselves. But I don't have a simple answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complex topic, isn't it? You just reminded me of something, actually, because you said about radical thinking, and one of the emails, or I was reading some of your stuff that you sent me, and there's something in the sale of the piece to the audience as well. It's the show copy. There's something in that, and I wonder if there is a radicalization of the way a show is, for want of a better word, sold to the consumer. It's, you know, where do you focus the show copy to get people to watch this? You know, what's the right way to administer this to the public as well, maybe?
Yeah, and I think that connects well with this idea that theatre organisations have to also market themselves. So, you know, every show is a part of their bigger ethos at any one moment in their season. And I think, especially with, you know, the big kind of rise in movements such as Black Lives Matter since the pandemic, and Me Too, there's been, I think that there's a lot of pressure now to also make sure that there's a performativity of how we're saying, oh, well, actually, we're addressing all of these things by staging all of these shows, and then there's an immediate pressure to market it. Whereas really, I think, you know, in some cases, it might be better to not address it at all and sit quietly and really address what your infrastructures are, what systems are you working within, what problems do you have in the organisation before doing that, because otherwise it's it's sort of tricking us into feeling like there's tons of progress, and that's not to demean the importance of theatre, of course, but the relationship between that and what it does for an organisation is huge. That can't be the only change. It has to come from the beginning and move outwards, you know.
Yeah, it almost hazes us a little bit, doesn't it? It's like you say, the big new initiative, and here we go. Oh, good, but whether it's actually doing it or not is another issue. Gosh, this is a lovely, juicy, big topic. I wish we could go on forever. It's amazing. I've learned so much. Thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully we'll get some nice comments and other people's thoughts below. So yeah.
I want people to get in touch with, you know, to talk about it. It's really important, and it's really nice to hear other people's perspectives. So thanks for having me.
That's all right. Cool. Thank you, Bryony.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye.